Good morning. I don't have anything more interesting to say than that. We're going to go with that. Usually I have like a joke that I can figure out, like, oh, it's morning, oh, it's really terrible, but it's actually a pretty good morning. So we're going to talk about how GitHub, and then in parentheses you have to say in a different voice, no longer works. But first, I want to talk about building a startup, because I've seen this happen a lot. And it's actually a pretty easy process to do this. Number one, you hire trendy rock stars. Then you're very super transparent about your company. You're very open. You write a lot of tech posts. Those rock stars go speak at conferences. You roll around in money because you're very successful at that point. You hire lots of people. You never, ever speak again. You ignore the community. You cash out. And then you start another company. This is very stupid. People do this all the time. I see my favorite programmers come up. I'm like, wow, you're joining this company. That company's going to be awesome. And then they tell you all about how they scale and do all this sort of stuff. And then eventually, I don't know, the lawyers get to them, or they become managers, or they build houses and live in Tahoe forever. And you never hear the interesting stuff that happens after they became famous as like a cool startup. That really is very sad to me. And that's what sort of this talk is trying to combat. There are lots and lots of talks about one-person companies, because they're very easy to make one-person companies. Here, I'm going to make a one-person company right now. We'll call it ZachCo, and now I can give a talk about how the story of ZachCo happened. Very easy. If Facebook employees are in the room, you can offer me $3 billion, and I will take that offer. Thousands of different talks about 10-person companies. There's a little bit fewer 10-person companies than one-person companies. Hundreds of talks about 100-person companies. Not a lot of talks about 1,000-person companies from the perspective of, I would like to build a company from 0 to 1,000. And I wanted to give this talk because I don't want GitHub to be that kind of douchey company that suddenly stops talking about how things work. Because even though we're not 10 employees anymore, there's some really interesting stuff that happens when you reach scale, whether that scale is technically or just growing humans and growing the company. So I'm Zach Holman. I've been at GitHub for almost 4 years now. And more importantly, I've been talking about GitHub a lot for the last 2 years. Lots of different talks like how GitHub uses GitHub to build GitHub, scaling GitHub, how GitHub works, how to build GitHub. A bunch of different talks because I really like talking about this stuff. I think it's really interesting to see how people build their companies. And I love this whole culture track because I think that's the really interesting stuff, because I think most companies do stuff really, really terribly. I think most companies still try and tackle product development in a really bad way. So that's what I love chatting about. But a lot of these talks that I've done have been sort of in the zone of when GitHub was like 30, 75 employees, 100 employees, which is great because that reflected our worldview at that time. But we're quite a bit different now. We're 217 employees at this point. And things are going to change from 5 employees to 217, trust me. And that's what I want to talk about today. You guys have probably heard about Dunbar's number, right? Everybody's heard everything about that. If you don't know the definition is an imaginary employee number that Hacker News fetishizes will kill your company. I see this all the time. Somebody does a cool YouTube or blog post about how their startup works, and then the angry Hacker News commenter's like, well, that won't work once you pass Dunbar's number. You're an asshole. And I hate Hacker News people so much. That's so sad. Anyway, the actual definition, it's a proposed maximum limit of relationships a human can meaningfully maintain. There's been a bunch of studies about group theory and group dynamics with human beings, in our case, companies. And they found that about 150 is the most a human brain can meaningfully have connections with all these people. So the relevancy is once you cross this moment, you can no longer rely on the fact that everybody knows everyone else and has close personal relationships with everyone else in the company, and therefore your company is going to explode and die or something like that. GitHub hasn't exploded and died yet, but 150 people, it does change things. To get to that point and to grow past that point, things have to adjust slightly. So that's what this talk is about. If you compare how I've said GitHub has worked in the past, and then you compare it to how we actually work today, the Venn diagram probably looks something like this. It's very similar. I didn't lie too much earlier on. And we work in the same fashion that we have always. But I think this stuff, the stuff really on the edge, the differences between those two is everything. And for me, it's really, really fascinating. It's business. Every little bit counts. And when you start multiplying it across a really large company, these changes are the most important changes ever. Like, there's very rarely is some company going to say, all right, we got rid of humans and now everyone's robots or something. The big changes don't happen anymore. The real progress and evolution is on those edges. So that's what this talk is all about, those edges, and looking at what we've said in the past that has worked well for us in the past and how things have changed for us as we've grown. So for those of you who haven't really seen much about how GitHub works, I'm going to give a 2-minute recap of everything I've been doing the last 2 years, since you've been ignoring all of my work and blog posts apparently, which made me really sad. But really quickly, GitHub is 60% remote. This is a really big foundation for everything we do. This sort of stemmed from when the founders would travel all across the world because that's how they like to work. They like to work from a conference somewhere in Tokyo or something. We tried to keep that atmosphere alive no matter how big we are. And we're still 60% remote today. So that depends. It's a big deal how we deal with our tools, how we deal with communication in the company, because everything has to support this premise that you can work wherever you want. Something that happens that supports that is the asynchronous. Is that a word? Asynchronicity? I don't know. We have an asynchronous workflow, and that supports working remotely. Basically, we try to favor pull requests, chat, email, things that mean we can work together on the same product but not have to be in the same room, in the same time zone, in the same office together. And we try to choose tools and build tools that help us achieve that goal as much as possible. The other thing I've said a bunch is GitHub has no managers. It's still true today to some extent. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's sort of, it's the idea that we let developers work on what they want to work on, what they think is the most valuable to the company. And that's worked out really well for us over the years. So there's a couple big picture sort of things I want to talk about, and we'll drill into them bit by bit, comparing it to what I may have said in the past. And the first thing I want to talk about is deploys. Deploying is, it's the whole shebang, at least in terms of the web workflow, deploying your code to production so everyone else can see it. I had a slide like this. Limit your deployments to staff only, to beta testers, to one server. Maybe you can deploy just to one app process on a particular server only. And that was cool. That's how we sort of did stuff for a long time. While building this talk, I realized that our deployments got a lot simpler. All of those sort of buckets of deployments ended up being just, we don't use them that much anymore. We rarely deploy to individual servers or subsets anymore. It used to be that if you wanted to roll something out that you were a little bit nervous about, you deploy to like FS22 and FS23 and see how it works on those two servers before you roll it out to everything else. In hindsight, we just don't really do that much anymore. We deploy to basically two different targets. One is production for everybody, and then another is a staff server in production. So a server just for us, GitHub employees, that is still a production server because it connects to the database, it uses all of our email hooks, it does everything else the same, except it's just cordoned off for us. It's kind of a subtle distinction, but the reason we do that is because of staging. We still have a staging environment because for some things, like networking, everything ops related, systems related, it's much harder to test that on a production system. You want to do a slow rollout, so staging is great for that. But if you're a regular app developer, we don't really push to staging much anymore. We always push to production or to a staff server in production. This is awesome because it leads to just fewer deployment targets, which means it's a simpler deploy line. We have maybe, 40 to 80 different people working on GitHub.com on a particular week. And that means a lot of deploys because we tend to deploy dozens and dozens of times a day just for the main app. And so there's deploy contention. Whose code is actually the real code on master right now? Who's deploying something else on a different branch? So like most things, we run it through our chat room robot, Hubot. We can just say, where do I deploy? And nowadays, it looks something like this. You can say, oh, production's totally unlocked. You can deploy there. Or the staff 1 server is locked by auto 42 minutes ago on this particular branch. These other 2 staff servers are open. And then another one is locked by Muon a few minutes ago as well. This gives you a nice snapshot of what is the actual working code in production. And this works well with how we lock branches as well. These are all branches that are deployed to a particular staff server. And once you've deployed to your staff server, it's locked, so only you can deploy to that. So there's no accidentally deploying over someone else's work, and so on. It's just a way to simplify deployment and making all of that much more brain dead and easier and safer to deploy. Something else I've said in the past is sort of leaning on staff-only feature flags. If you haven't used feature flags before, you should. Flickr sort of popularized this ages ago when Flickr was popular. I'm sorry, Flickr people in the audience. But it's fantastic. We do this all over the place. And we don't just do this in the web. We do feature flags in all of our native software as well. Like Github for Mac, Github for Windows do the same thing. If you're in the right organization, typically GitHub, you get the new features. So you can see stuff out in the real world as soon as possible. Looking at how I was talking about this before, and deployments got way more staff shipped. As we've grown bigger, we staff ship more and more and more and more. Most of our features now, if they're user-facing, and a lot of them that are not user-facing, are staff shipped for weeks or months at a time. And the result of that can sometimes depend. We had a project that we hired people for, and people were working on it for a good year, year and a half, and it was staff shipped the entire time so we could play around with it. And ultimately, in August or something, we were like, what the hell are we doing? This is really stupid, and just axed it, the whole thing. But it was powerful because we could see that in production, and it gave us the authority and freedom to say, all right, this is not something we want to do anymore. Let's just axe and go a totally different direction. The other side effect with this is that we sort of stopped using external beta testers entirely. We never really did this very frequently anyway. But every now and then we try to ask people like, hey, would you like to try out this new feature that we haven't announced yet on GitHub? And most people are like, yes. And we're like, will you give us feedback? And they're like, yes. And then 2 months later, they're like, it was good. We're like, that's completely worthless. I mean, it's not, you're not a good tester. So, I mean, this is the reason why we staff ship stuff more. We don't have a problem finding vocal, opinionated employees. People tend to get really angry about stuff. And they have no real, they will give you feedback on whatever you've just staff shipped, which is great. And they are far more, for most use cases, they're going to be a better place to turn for if you're trying to find honest feedback on a feature that you're trying to ship. The other thing that's really changed in the last 6 months is we have a much more bigger focus on team shipping versus staff shipping. So for example, if you're working on, we launched two-factor authentication earlier this year. And so in this example, the people working on two-factor auth would launch it just to the people on the two-factor auth GitHub team on GitHub. So the 3 or 4 of them who are working on that feature on the front end, on the back end, would see the new stuff, and then me as a regular staff member would not see it. The reason why we do this is a lot of different reasons, but the main reason is that you can move quicker. I'm trying to do something right now that I want to get team shipped, and I want to team ship it because if I had to staff ship it, it would have to be a lot more polished. It's not ready to have everyone say, oh, this is terrible, this is broken, this doesn't work, because I know it's broken, but I want to get it out to production as soon as possible. So team shipping has been really awesome. We're limiting the scope of the ship that you're trying to work on, the code that you're trying to get into production, but you can do it a lot faster and get it out in production faster and see what the performance looks like, how it actually feels, how the design works in practice. Something else that I want to talk about is people, because I love people. As much as I hate people, I love people. I had a slide here, reduce institutional knowledge. And the idea was that you put as much as possible documented in wikis, issues, chats, and pull requests, because you don't want to have one person in your company that has all the answers, and then they become a blocker, where if you're new to the company, you have to talk to that one person and say, oh, how do I do this, how do I do this? I went on another slide that said, your new hire is stoked to dive in, start reading, and start contributing, so don't get in their way. Document as much as possible. That's kind of true, but I think that was wrong in some respects. I think we need to get in their way a lot more. I think keeping information as accessible as possible is amazing. And everything should have a URL to all of your work that you're doing so everyone can go see what's going on. But that's not really what I'm talking about. As we've grown, I think we need to indoctrinate people into the company much better than how we had been doing it in the last year or so. Because it's just harder to acclimate to larger companies. I mean, compared to my first week at GitHub was at Cavalli Cafe, because we didn't have a company, or we didn't have an office yet. And PJ was like, hey, there's the bathroom, and then if you want some coffee, buy some fucking coffee or something. And that was like the extent of my indoctrination in the company, because there was just not that much stuff there. At 200 some, there's just lots of different things. And they're not, coding style and development methodologies, those are a lot easier to pick up. But things like, where do I get my check? Where's the bathroom? How do I deal with HR? How do I deal with all these different people? And it takes a long time to sort of acclimate to that. And I think that's sort of where we fell down for a long time, is that we thought that it was still easy because we had all joined the company at an easy time to do it. You still have a buddy for your first week. We've been doing this for years now, where your first week, even if you're remote, you have to come into San Francisco, sit down with somebody, and just sort of work on stuff together, and they are a good place to bounce ideas off and say, well, does this make sense? Is this what I should be doing? So that's great. That's always been awesome. And then we're really good at just saying, here's your second week, go, which is really disorienting because you have no idea what to work on. Your buddy sort of disappears because that's not their buddy week anymore and they have other stuff to do. So that's been really problematic. So something we're trying to do now is to sort of experiment with longer buddy relationships. I don't know what to call this. It's sort of like an apprenticeship, but all the words that I'm trying to come up with sounds condescending, because it's not really that. We're trying to hire smart people, and we don't want to make them sound like, oh, you're not official until a month from now or something. But just have a very informal buddy system of oh, this is somebody I can literally go to in case I run into a problem with deployment methodologies or something like that. So I think that's something that we've sort of changed and sort of 180'd on, is that I think there needs to be a stronger relationship as you grow a company and just sort of bring somebody into the folds of the company, because the culture stuff is a lot harder to learn than anything else. I had a really weird sort of slide that said trust your employees. It's kind of weird standalone, but what this sort of meant is that let your people focus on your work. And that was a big part, because we had a lot of us sort of had managers who were very micromanagey, what are you doing today? How does this look? What are you doing today? How does this look like? How does this work? And that's kind of frustrating, because you don't want people buzzing around and just let me do my work and that's cool. So the goal of that, trust your employees to just do the work and then just sort of stay hands off, is a good idea. But the drawback is on the employee side. You reduce your feedback dramatically if you're completely hands off. And it's not just you're doing a shit job, I'm going to fire you. It's you're doing a good job. Keep it up. Just that sort of positive feedback, you end up missing a lot. This is where imposter syndrome comes into play. And I'm glad that there's been a lot more people talking about this in our industry in the last few years, it seems. The idea that, I don't belong. There's all these smart people around me, they've been here for years and they know all of the system and they're just, genius. Why do I belong here? And I think that this is a problem, definitely in GitHub and definitely just in tech in general, because, that's the type of thing that we deal with. So I think that's sort of the problem with being completely hands-off, is that we had a hard time just sort of supporting people and saying, yeah, you're on the right track. You're doing a really good job. Just that little bit can help dramatically. This is even harder for remote workers. If I'm in San Francisco, I can at least grab a beer, grab lunch with you, and say what are your problems? How are you doing this sort of stuff? But if you're remote, and you're not in one of the cities where there are a lot of other remote workers for us, like Portland or Boulder or something like that, it's a lot harder to have those sort of informal interactions like that. It's a lot harder to IM somebody and say, how am I doing? Because it seems like a weird communication medium. You have to be in person for this sort of stuff. So that's just going to be a hard problem no matter what company you're in. We're trying a bunch of different things. The longer buddying, I think, will help with that a lot. So you have a longer relationship with somebody and somebody to turn to. We're trying to do a lot more Hangouts and just more video stuff, Skyping, just to get more face-to-face stuff. And then just more meet space visits, more seeing people in real life. We used to do these 2 big meetups a year of all of GitHub would come into San Francisco and see everybody else. And we're now reducing that to 1 and then adding a lot more team visits. So you would come up with your team to either San Francisco or another city and just talk with your team for a few days, either about work or just hanging out. Because remote work is just harder to fix, or not fix. Remote work's a lot harder to make really, really great. So it just takes a lot more time to try and do that. Sometimes I have slides like this. in this case, we had 108 employees at the time, and nobody had quit. People like to talk about this a lot. And we made it to 199. That was the total extent. And I'm super happy about that. I was never super into like number game and stuff. Obviously, people are going to quit and go on to bigger and better things at some point, and that's awesome. Like I want Github to be a point where people can jump off and do some really interesting things on their own. But I think it's the idea that we try to retain as much employees as possible. We're trying to make people as excited as possible to work there, which is interesting. So that's not true anymore, but our turnover is still really low. If you're also including people that we had to let go. Most turnover, I've seen some studies around 15%. So I mean, people leave, but minimizing is still super important. And that's the main goal we've always had, is that we just want to keep people as happy as possible. And I don't think enough companies worry about, I think companies just worry so much on hiring that they forget that building an atmosphere to let people thrive in their own company is super, super important. Apparently I have a couple slides that are really weird in hindsight. One of them was like this, sort of the aspects of GitHub, and the one in the bottom was full ownership. Then this happened. We raised $100 million, which is a lot of money. We have a new office in July, and we have a room where we have the whole $100 million on a table, and you can rub it on your face and stuff. And it's a lot of money. You can rub it on your face for a long time. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about money. There's a lot. I mean, this could be a talk in and of itself, because I think it was a big deal for us. And the one thing I want to talk about today is that for us, funding somehow lended us legitimacy, which is really strange. Like suddenly big media covered us. On the first day, I mean, it was Andreessen's biggest Series A they've ever given. Obviously, there's going to be like Washington Post and all these guys start covering us. And then it just kept going. Like, I mean, we're in Wired like every month or something now, and the New York Times is talking about us and stuff. And everyone's trying to figure out what the hell Git is, and it's really strange. Suddenly TechCrunch had a GitHub writer just working purely on GitHub stories, which is strange because for the first 3 or 4 years of our lives, I don't think anybody knew who we were at TechCrunch. They wrote up one minor article and then ignored us entirely. Other weird things, suddenly it was easier to lease office space. We would go around San Francisco saying, yes, we make lots of money, we're profitable, we've been bootstrapped, and it's awesome. And then all these like landlords would be like, whoa, you're not funded? You don't have debt? I don't know if I can rent out to you. We're like, no, we're a business. This is like actually a good thing. We can actually afford to do things and plan our, and they're like, no, you need some money. And then when we raised money, it was totally fine. They were like, here, just throwing offices at us and stuff. So the tech industry is crazy. I mean, I don't really have anything else to say than this, but I don't understand the fascination with all of this sort of stuff. And it's been really strange to sort of realize this from the inside. But I guess the one thing I do want to say with this is that Bootstrap was our key foundation. And I think it got us to the place of being able to get really good terms and being on good terms with really good VCs that aren't scumbags, and we can still do whatever the hell we want to do. And I think that just stemmed from the fact that we didn't need any money. For the longest time, we just said, no, we don't need your money, which means that the person is just, take my money, please. People want what they can't have, I guess. And by delaying the idea that like we needed to take VC, we could wait until it was a really good idea for us to do that. But I mean, the industry is still freaking crazy. This city is ridiculous. And I love San Francisco too. It's fantastic. I want to talk about organization aspects for a little bit too. I had a slide sort of about teams. Some of these aren't even teams anymore. I can't remember what the redacted ones were. Some feature we probably shipped. One of them's probably GitHub for Windows. But I kind of look back at this, and there's only like a handful of teams because this is when we were a lot younger. But teams became a lot more important for us. This is not something that will probably blow your mind. As a company gets bigger, they're going to want to start sorting themselves out into smaller, more manageable pieces. So there's a lot of stuff you can talk about this too, but the one particular aspect I want to talk about is opinions. And these are a byproduct of how we set up our teams at GitHub. For the longest time, we resisted forming teams because we had a lot of people that wanted to work on a lot of different things. People had opinions on everything. I don't write Cocoa or anything, but we wanted an atmosphere where I could go into the GitHub for Mac team and say, wow, wouldn't it be cool if? because you can stimulate a lot of really cool ideas and possible new features that way. So we wanted people to generate these opinions and tell people more and more about dive into different things. But the problem is when you get bigger, drive-by opinions are less valuable because you have 217 opinions getting thrown at you. It's hard to sort of stay the course and start focusing on what the actual work needs to do. And some are just less valuable in terms of if you're working on the team and thinking about this particular problem day and night, you're going to have a better context than the person who has thought about this in the morning when they saw the pull request and wanted to shit on it. So it's a weird balance between trying to set up, respect everyone's opinions, but still sort of work on the opinions that really matter. And one thing that I've sort of been realizing, it's a really subtle point, is that team mentions are really great filters. So team mentions is what I mean when on like a GitHub issue or GitHub pull request, or we do this in chat as well, we'll just like CC somebody. So I'll say like, oh, at GitHub/design, we'll ping the designers on GitHub, or maybe I have an ops question and I'll ping the systems team or the ops teams. If I want to DJ a party, I'll ping the techno team at GitHub. We literally have a techno team at GitHub. And I think the interesting thing I've been realizing is that people don't stay on these teams unless they're really interested in it. For example, I was on the security list for a couple of years at GitHub because specifically, I do a lot of these talks, and I didn't want to get on stage if somebody had just hacked the site or something like that. So I wanted to know what people were finding, or if an upstream provider had a problem with their users or something like that. And it was interesting to me for a while. And then I got to the point where I don't tend to deal with security matters. I tend to create security vulnerabilities rather than fix security vulnerabilities. And it just became, it's too much noise for me. So I dropped out of the security list, and because I trusted them to actually do the work and do all the good stuff that they've been doing. And I think that's a really subtle but really interesting way. We're not maintaining that you have to be on this team because that's your official job title and stuff. People can sort of self-select into what they find most valuable for their time. This is the same rationale we have for doing team shipping versus staff shipping, like I mentioned earlier. It's sort of reducing the amount of noise. You have to have some skin in the game to sort of comment on the thread that we're talking about, because you're on the team, you're getting all the noise on the list or the issue or whatever, and it sort of reduces and clarifies who is most wanting to be in that discussion with you. And it protects against negative feedback. GitHub definitely has a problem with this, but I think it's just tech industry in general. Programmers have a weird emotional response of being unemotional. They're just like, oh, this is crap. And I'm unemotional about it, so therefore, I hate you or something. People get really negative sometimes. And this is sort of, again, it sort of prevents that drive-by, feedback where somebody can just come in on an hour and just ruin your day, and then they leave for something else. So that's been a really subtle thing with teams that I've really, I just find fascinating. That's sort of worked really well for us. I had another slide about the different chat rooms GitHub had. At that time we had 30. Now we're 150 or so. I only bring this up because rooms are cheap. I've talked to a lot of companies that don't realize you can have multiple different rooms to have different discussions in. Particularly smaller companies will just dump everything into one room. So they'll have animated GIFs, and then really important deploy stuff, and then animated GIFs. We are aggressive in terms of building out new rooms. Some of them are temporary for 2 months. Maybe somebody's going to be in Italy for a couple months or something with a bunch of other GitHubbers, and they want to make an Italy room and talk with everybody. Sometimes they're very feature specific. If we're going to revamp, or if we're going to add two-factor authentication, we'll have a 2FA room. And it's really great because the more rooms you have, the higher signal to noise. And it doesn't end up getting too crazy. I idle in 5 different rooms on a regular basis. And it's all very, I don't feel like it's too crazy. Just because you have a lot of rooms doesn't mean you have to hang out in 150 different rooms at the same time. Part of how this works for us is that we get push notifications to our phone and to our computers if somebody mentions your name. So you don't have to idle anywhere, but if somebody says Holman right now in a chat room, I'll get notified, and I can just hop in, say yes, no, maybe, I don't know, and then leave. And it's a very straightforward way to deal with all of this rush of communication that you generate as you just grow into a bigger company. I've had a bunch of slides like this. This sort of goes hand in hand with, like, we have no managers, so therefore everybody is a manager. That's still the truth. We still have no managers, like, whose job title is like, I'm a manager and I'm going to manage humans and stuff. It's sort of hard to generalize how things like this work because teams work in very different fashions. And it's hard to generalize across the company. We have some teams that work, hand in hand with pair programming. Some people are really big into, like, test-driven development, and for the most part, we don't really care about those logistics. But I want to talk generally, sort of on a higher level, about how this sort of stuff works now. And some teams have a perp. Perp is a primarily responsible person, and we say perp for everything. You can perp whole teams, you can perp specific events, or features, or I'm going to write a blog post, so I'm going to perp that. That basically means that there's one person that it comes down to whose job it is to make sure that that ships, or make sure that that is stable, or make sure that we can go to them for estimations on how the project is going. So we've sort of split teams out with somebody who is sort of in charge of that. But it's not like a full-time job still. Like, it's amazing, like, you still don't need to have people sit down and say, like, all right, you work on this, you work on this. 90 to 95% of their time, even if they're the perp, is still going to be building the actual product, designing the actual product. Part of what we've also been doing is splitting into smaller and smaller teams. I think it became very easy to just say, all right, now we're going to start having teams in the company, and we're going to have a team of 10 here and a team of 20. And I think it ends up slowing down the development process a lot. So we've tried to slim down teams a lot more, typically down to like 1 or 2 developers per team and 1 or 2 designers. And that tends to work out really well in terms of, like, actual feature work. And this means that you can sort of self-manage a lot faster. And if it ends up being the problem where you feel like you need a lot more developers or a lot more designers to help you out with something, more often than not, you can break up the problem into multiple teams. We had something over the last year which had 8 or 9 different developers working on it, and it didn't really go anywhere. It went really slowly. It was a slow-moving project. And then in the last few months, we started realizing, oh, how about we just split up half of this into back-end refactoring and the other end into the UI? And once we did that, it started just going a lot quicker. So splitting into different smaller teams, I think, has been, it sort of retains our spirit as a sort of hacker company without being really big and crazy. I had a talk like this, talking about remote work again. And the thing I want to talk about is, like, recorded talks, FaceTime, ways to make remote employees feel like they are still part of the company, even though they aren't in the main office in San Francisco. As I look at this slide, I sort of realized that, like, we just have a lot more resources for remote experiences now. We can devote a lot more time and money into making these experiences better, more than we ever could in the past. Previously, we had a little dinky Arduino motion tracking Kinect video capture machine in the back corner, so like, if I could walk around the stage, it would, like, follow me, because the guy was our CTO and he didn't want to, like, film people anymore, so he just said, I'm just going to automate it. But now we have a 3-person team dedicated just to doing like filming, basically like this, like filming talks. So you can screen share in or watch the stream and feel like you're actually getting all of the communication going on in San Francisco's office right now. So these are the photos. That's our little dinky machine. And now we have something called the Eagle's Nest in the main Github office now, where they handle all this sort of stuff. And we run different events, different, like, hacker meetups and stuff in San Francisco. We have event space for that now. So that's great. And I think that just, in hindsight, I think remote work requires a lot more work to do well. Because you still, the easiest answer would just be like, well, you're not in San Francisco, deal with it. And that really sucks. And it's really hard to create a culture where remote work just feels like it's the same anywhere. Formal events like this is really easy. You set up a guy in the back. I don't mean to make fun of you guys filming me right now, but you have a camera and you set up some time, and then you record them and you dismiss, or you send out the recordings to everybody else. That's cool. It's the informal conversations that are really hard. We can't just hire 200 people to film us and all of our conversations and send them to the rest of the company, because 1, that would be creepy, and 2, that would be really creepy. But I think there's some interesting things we can do there as well. And getting back to the idea earlier about getting more feedback at an informal level rather than doing it in an IM conversation, which is a lot weirder situation for it. So we've been trying to experiment a little bit more with these sort of informal approaches of capturing the experience, but on a remote level. One is, these are mostly silly, but they're kind of fun to talk about. We have 2 remote iPads in the office. They're sort of like built on these little segways. You're at eye level, and then you can FaceTime in, so you can sort of control them and move around the office, and then like talk to people. Something else we haven't really done, but we've been talking about doing internally. I built something 3 years ago called Facelet, which was a combination of chat roulette and FaceTime. So you could just randomly like FaceTime people and talk to random people. I really want that internally at the company too, because I think it would be great, because I'm past the point where I can remember everyone's face or even their name at this point. I lost that at like 20 people anyway, but I'm not good with names. But I love this idea that you sort of just group people together that wouldn't normally otherwise work with people. And sort of doing that randomly, I think, would be really fascinating. And then the other thing we've sort of been talking about is doing persistent two-way streams at the office, where we have a TV and a camera, and you can just walk up to it and talk to whoever is screen shared in. It's the little things, like they're all goofy ideas, but I think they're kind of interesting, and you get people talking about stuff and trying to figure out different ways of tackling this problem, because it's just hard. So those are most of the slides I had. I had a couple things that I just wanted to talk about in hindsight, because this was a really fun talk for me to build, because it's fun to see where you were and how you got to the place you are now and how much different you are between the two of them. One thing that's always stuck out to me, this is actually in our doc directory on Github. It's build websites like it's 2005. And I think that sort of works across everything, not just like websites, but just our whole technology. We try to do things as boring as possible and as old as possible because those things work. And I think our tech stack shrinks as we age. We keep reducing trendy languages and databases. Like right now, it's really pretty straightforward. We're Ruby, C, Git, and MySQL, and then like Memcache or something. We try not to do much more than that. I mean, Greg was talking about this a little bit right before this. Is like the very monolithic culture, and I think that's kind of cool. I think your product should be very cutting edge, not your technology. And if you're trying to say that like the technology will save your company or something, like it won't. Like the really cool stuff is what you can do with the ideas of workflows. How can you make people's lives better? Not just like, look, it's a JavaScript framework that talks to an API, and now it can do both at the same time. Like nobody cares about that. Some people do. Stability is sexy. I think that needs to be said a lot more. We are still on Rails 2.3. It's a weird monster. We have some stuff that's not even Rails 4 yet, so it's like, I don't know, it's like 3.9 or something like that. But I don't think it's necessarily needs to be something that you need like the newest NoSQL database in order to build a company. And I think GitHub has a really good resistance towards adding crazy stuff like that, because you shouldn't be experimenting on your tech stack. You should be experimenting on your users. You guys, I don't know. The other thing I want to mention is just, I couldn't figure out a better way to say this, so I just said resisting doing shit just to do shit. By this, I mean, I think GitHub does a good job of remaining skeptical towards a lot of established stuff. A lot of things, we're big now, so I guess we should add teams. Like adding teams was a really big conversation at GitHub for the longest time because things were falling apart in some respects. Like communication was having a hard time moving from this idea of like, 50 to 75 people were like, well, not everybody can have their fingers in so many pies anymore. You have to start splitting this up, but how do we do that? The naive response is just like add teams and have like, somebody in charge of the team, and then you have like different, roles and stuff. But it took us like a year to try and figure out, we went through a bunch of different tools that we tried to build like, all right, this tool will fix us and our teams are going to be perfect now because we have this tool and it has a visualization of all the graph networks connected. And it was all worthless. And we finally got to the point where it was very low maintenance, very lightweight. And I think it was cool to go that long. There are naturally things that are going to be emergencies where you have to do something right now. But I think as long as you can resist doing things just because you do things, I think that is kind of a credit to the company if you can do that. So that's mostly what I had. I think your company should change. I was going through a lot of this sort of stuff, and on some level I was kind of weird because I was like, oh, these are all these slides and I'm wrong about them now, but they were totally true when I said them, and I think it's just kind of interesting to recognize that things will change in your company as you grow bigger. That's sort of the reason why companies are what they are. Like, they grow, and that's a good thing. But I think your values shouldn't change. And I hate, I don't write down our values or our mission statement or crap like that because I think it's all worthless. But you inherently have an idea of like how your company should be set up, how these things should work, what do you actually care about. So just think about what needs to change and let it. And it may not have to be big, massive changes or anything like that, but the little things are what matters. And just start thinking about this sort of stuff. So that's what I've got. Thanks. So the question for those at home are, this guy thinks we don't have, or we do have managers. I think otherwise. No. The best thing, this is again something we've realized in hindsight, is, and we've been saying this a lot without realizing how we've worked this way for years, is that we work like an open source company. And I think in different projects there are sort of, I guess, spiritual leaders or something that you can go to in terms of like, how should this code work? Well, you've been working on this for 4 years. You have a good context of how this stuff sort of works together. But I mean, I don't see anybody whose full-time job is to be that person. I don't think Linus would call himself a manager necessarily. Maybe he does, and I don't know. But I think his work on the Linux kernel is still, he's still working on stuff. So that's what it comes down to for me, is like, is your main job producing code? And pretty much everyone is. So yeah, so I sort of glossed that over. The question was about staffship versus teamship. It's literally just GitHub teams for us. And if you are on that particular team, it's like the same as feature flags. Like, if current user dot is on this particular team, show them this particular content, otherwise don't. So that's what it is. We just set it up based on the teams, and then we do that. So the question is, how do we deal with things that cut across teams, given that we have very small teams? I don't know. I think that's one of those things that's not super, it doesn't come up in practice as much. The best example would be like GitHub Enterprise, which is probably a team of 50 or 60 at this point. But it's a bunch of smaller teams. And they get together as the enterprise team a couple of times a year to figure out the high-level plans and stuff like that. And I think that covers a lot of things, because there's not a lot of day-to-day stuff where I'm like, I'm just going to go off this way and screw my team or something like that. You can get a lot done and planning for and figured out ahead of time. In terms of like code reuse and stuff, rather than try and plan that out, I think it just sort of works in terms of like, this could work for everybody else. Let's extract it, and in Ruby land, let's make it a gem or make it a different library, and start putting it in other projects. We're sort of helped by the fact that our biggest use case for that is Git. Git access we use in a lot of different projects, especially GitHub.com. And we're able to get around that because we've had 2 libraries in the past that are already extracted out, and we can share amongst all of our projects. So Grit initially, and now it's libgit2, which is all open source. So on that, we can lean on that heavily for a bunch of different projects, like GitHub for Mac, GitHub for Windows, and GitHub.com all use the same library to deal with Git repositories and stuff. But I think overall, I think it's not something that I feel like I look around and I'm seeing all this like redundant features that nobody is communicating amongst everybody else. So the question is, how much of our success is based on the fact that we can dog food stuff? I think it's a lot. It depends on what you're talking about, though. I think that there are certain things that are problem space agnostic. The way that we work on basic level like pull requests, I think can sort of work everywhere. The fact that we can dog food stuff is awesome. And I think that it lets us step back and let people work on what they want. My sort of, the thing I tend to say is that I want people to look at how we do stuff and then pick apart what makes the most sense for them. Some companies are much more anti-remote work, so maybe the way we use chat just doesn't make any sense for them, and that's cool. So mostly I just want to point out an example of a possible way how to work. Because a lot of the times it's just, it's weird. Like companies just love to hear how other people do stuff, not necessarily because it's better, but because somebody else is doing it, and they can point to them as an example and be like, well, they're using it. Can we use it? So I think I don't know. On some level, I don't know. I would love to work for a company that dog foods their product all the time anyway. So, but that's just me personally. So the question was about discoverability of teams and how many teams people are on. Usually many. It depends on the person. Some people, and it depends on your involvement on the team as well. Designers typically are passed around a lot because they can just hop in, bust out a quick design, and then move on to some other stuff, while developers spend a lot more time doing the real work. I can say that because there are like no designers in this room, right? No, it's great that we can have designers go around. Same is true for backend as well. People will typically be involved in a bunch of different projects, but usually people will try to focus in on one primarily for like 3/4 of their time. Discoverability is, I would say the best way to discover what teams are working on what is, I guess we're very repository centric. So if I wanted to change something on github.com, I would go to github/github on GitHub and then ask either open an issue or a pull request, or just talk to people we have a room called the .com room where we talk about .com matters, and just start talking to people. And they will either point you to the specific team working in that project on what feature you're talking about, or they will just tell you themselves. The other nice thing is just get blame. Sometimes I'll just like, look, who touched this code last? Now you have to deal with my questions because you touched it last. So, how do we settle disagreements? Sparring typically. There's a couple different things there. One is if there's a disagreement, I think that's usually a good sign that both sides are wrong in some respect. We've had that a few times where people will be arguing for like a couple of days or weeks about these, well, we should do this, no, we should do this. And a lot of the times we'll just say, like, no, we're both wrong at this point, back off. And a lot of the times we'll come back like a month later and it's very obvious and like, oh, that was the wrong idea. The other aspect is like, it's easier to argue stuff if you actually have code. So sometimes this ties back into the whole staff shipping thing. If you say like, I understand you don't want me to do whatever I'm doing, but I'm just going to staff ship this. It's easy to take out if we don't like it. I want you to actually use it. Because a lot of disagreements happen if it's imaginary. And it's easier to take pot shots at code rather than at ideas. And then finally, like, there are cases where something is really important and we need to do something right now. Like a use case is the servers are filling up and we're going to run out of hard disk space in the next week. For the love of God, figure something out. And that's sort of where the idea of like the perp, the primarily responsible person, comes into play. Of like there's somebody whose neck is on the line of, well, they've been working on this for 4 years. They are sort of responsible of the ultimate stability of the service, and they're just going to come in and make a decision. And typically that's, it's not, there are rationales on why they are that person, and people tend to trust them with their judgment. And there's been a lot of times where I would just say, like, no, you're an idiot. I still disagree with your statement or whatever. And then 6 months later, I'm like, yeah, he was right. And I never tell him that because I don't want to give him higher ego. But I mean, it really depends on the use case. I think 80% of the time, it's just a matter of just talking it out, or possibly not talking it out for a while and letting people sink on it for a little bit and figure it out. So. Is there a maximum limit to GitHub, or if we would do anything differently? So I started writing about GitHub. I did a couple blog posts, and we were like 25 people, I think. And like every step of the way, like this won't work when you're 40, this won't work when you're 50, Dunbar's number. So everybody's been saying it's not going to work. I personally thought it would stop working around 90 or so. I was pretty pessimistic. But we still work in much the same way as we did when we could fit around the same coffee table. There are suggestions that, Valve operates a similar way. They're probably up to like 500 or so now, 600. If you want to get really crazy, there's a company down in like South America that works up to like 8,000 people. Gore is another example of thousands of people that work sort of in a mesh-like fashion. So I think it's possible. I don't feel like things are going to explode anytime soon. So I think that's a good indication. But it's as was the case with everything, I mean, we'll just take it piece by piece, and if stuff starts breaking, we'll start, fixing it. And I think it's much easier to do that rather than, try and plan out the perfect plan right now. So I think that's all I got the time for. So thanks.